It was one of those peculiar spring mornings in London when the rain decides it would rather not make up its mind. I just settled into a corner table at the Café Royal, nursing a mild headache and a rather more severe coffee, when I caught sight of Hercule Poirot, my friend and, dare I say, the most brilliant detective in Europe, gliding toward me with the elegance of a man wholly undeterred by the damp outside. He was, as ever, immaculate. A dove-grey suit tailored within an inch of its life, his moustaches as gleaming and symmetrical as twin sabres. He held a folded note between two fingers with a dainty suspicion one might reserve for an opera ticket handed over by a known liar. "My dear Hastings," he said, lowering himself into the chair opposite me, "have you any plans this afternoon that do not involve the consumption of overcooked English lamb?" I hadn't quite decided yet, I admitted, though I was toying with the idea of a matinee. "Then abandon it." He patted the note. "We have been summoned, rather urgently, I might add, to Surrey." "Another murder?" I asked, more eagerly than was polite. Poirot shrugged. "That, mon ami, remains to be seen, but when a certain Countess Vera Orlov Smirnova writes with such drama, one suspects the ordinary tea party is not on the menu." The name stirred something faint in my memory. Wasn't she the Russian émigré who caused such a stir with her self-portraits? I remember hearing about a scandal. Something about a poisoned painting, Poirot finished, tapping the note. "Oui. And now, it seems, a rather more fatal incident has occurred. Come, Hastings. There is a motor car waiting, and a mystery, I suspect, whose surface has only just been scratched." The estate was called Pavonia House, a Baroque monstrosity nestled between meticulously maintained yew hedges and a moody forest thick with dew. A valet opened the wrought iron gate with the solemnity of a tomb keeper. We were greeted at the steps not by the Countess herself, but by a Mr. Edwin Varner, her private secretary, a slight, sharp-eyed man in spectacles that glinted like ice under the uncertain sunlight. "You must be Monsieur Poirot," he said, voice clipped and dry. "Thank you for coming. The Countess is unwell. This morning she discovered the body of her niece. Miss Lydia Halberd was found dead in the East Gallery." Poirot's gaze narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Dead, monsieur. From what cause?" "Poison," said Varner flatly. "At first glance, an overdose of barbiturates, but there's something strange about it. She was found lying directly in front of the Countess's latest self-portrait, a painting, incidentally, that she had tried to destroy only days ago." "Tiens," Poirot murmured. "How curious. And yet, you do not think it suicide?" Varner's lips pressed into a thin line. "The Countess believes it was murder, and she believes the motive lies within the painting." The gallery was a cathedral of silence. Heavy drapes muffled the world outside, and the scent of turpentine lingered in the still air. The painting dominated the far wall, an imposing canvas of the Countess herself, regal and aloof in crimson velvet, her expression unreadable, her hand raised as if in command or refusal. Miss Lydia Halberd's body had been removed, but a faint impression on the carpet remained, an outline too still, too final. Poirot stood before the portrait, arms folded, his gaze flicking not over the brushwork, but the space around it. "She died here?" he asked. Varner nodded. "At precisely 10 o'clock this morning, the Countess was due to meet her for tea. Instead, she found her like that, slumped, cold, no cup, no note." "Tell me, Mr. Varner," Poirot said, tilting his head, "how well did the young lady get on with her aunt?" Varner hesitated. "It was complicated." "Ah." Poirot smiled without humor. "Très bien. Then let us begin with complications." The parlor at Pavonia House was a curious blend of Slavic opulence and British austerity, much like its mistress. Velvet drapes pooled like blood at the floor, a bronze samovar steamed gently on a tray, and a disapproving portrait of a Cossack ancestor glared down upon us from above the fireplace. Countess Vera Orlov-Smirnova sat in a carved chair by the window, cloaked in a shawl the color of old wine. She was not what I had expected. Her hair was white as frost, but elegantly pinned, and her skin bore the fine, translucent quality of porcelain. Yet there was nothing frail about her eyes. They were steel, sharpened by exile and loss. "Poirot," she said with the faintest of accents, "I feared you would refuse me." "My dear Countess," Poirot bowed deeply, "I would never decline a lady in distress, particularly when the circumstances are so unusual." She gave a mirthless chuckle. Unusual is a mild word for Pavonia these days. "Sit, both of you." We obeyed, and the samovar was pressed into use, emitting an aroma of rich black tea as a silent maid poured for us all. Poirot declined sugar, while I took 3 lumps and immediately burned my tongue. "I trust Mr. Varner has informed you of the essentials," the Countess said, fixing her eyes on Poirot. "My niece Lydia is dead, they say overdose, but I tell you, it was not her hand that took her life, it was someone else's." Poirot tapped a finger lightly on his cup. "What leads you to such a conclusion, madame?" She reached into a drawer of the sideboard and retrieved a folded letter, which she handed to him. It was written in a bold, slanted hand. "Aunt Vera, you must destroy the new portrait. You must. There is poison in the paint. I know how that sounds, but I swear it's true. It will kill you or someone else. Please listen to me. I'll explain everything tomorrow morning. I beg you, do not go into the gallery until we've spoken. Lydia, this arrived late last night," the Countess said. "By then I'd already gone to bed. I found it on the hall table this morning after I found her body." I looked at Poirot, who had gone very still. "You say she tried to destroy the painting?" 3 days ago. She came into my studio while I was out. Slashed the canvas with a palette knife. I was furious. I assumed some madness had seized her. I even accused her of jealousy. How little I knew. Poirot folded the letter with careful hands. "Tell me, madame, who was in the house last night?" The Countess exhaled slowly, then stood. "Come, I will introduce you." We were taken to a drawing room where 5 individuals sat or stood in various poses of unease. Poirot paused before entering, brushing invisible dust from his cuffs. Then, like a magistrate entering court, he stepped inside. "Ladies and gentlemen," said the Countess with a sweep of her hand, "this is Monsieur Hercule Poirot, who will be investigating Lydia's death. You will extend him every courtesy. You will answer his questions fully. You will not leave Pavonia until he gives his consent." Her tone brooked no argument. She turned and left, shutting the door with a finality that made the windows tremble. Poirot surveyed the room with the calm of a general inspecting the enemy's trench. I followed suit, notebook at the ready. First was Miss Isabel Greaves, an angular woman in her early 30s, all severe lines and darker silks. The Countess's companion and live-in art assistant, she possessed a stare like a ruler laid across one's knuckles. Next, Major Geoffrey Halberd, Lydia's older brother, a thick-necked military type with a ruddy face, balding and bitter, clearly unaccustomed to powerlessness. Beside him lounged Rex Colville, a pale young man in a velvet smoking jacket. He offered us a wry smile, his fingers toying with an ivory-handled cane. I'd seen his name recently, an art critic with a scandalous reputation and a gift for savage prose. On the far settee sat Miss Felicity Dane, a mousy woman with eyes like darts. She was Lydia's cousin on her mother's side, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked perpetually on the verge of confession. Lastly, Mr. Edwin Varner, the secretary, now stood behind a small drinks table, polishing a glass he had no intention of using. His eyes remained unreadable behind those glinting spectacles. Poirot stepped into the center of the room. Mes amis, he said softly. A young woman has died under most unusual circumstances. The law may be content to call it suicide. I, however, am not so easily satisfied. Therefore, we shall begin with the facts. He turned to Miss Greaves. You are the Countess's assistant, n'est-ce pas? Were you aware of Miss Halbert's attempt to destroy the portrait? I was the one who found the damage, she said coolly. The brushstrokes were beyond saving. Lydia had always loathed the Countess's art. She called it narcissistic. The irony, of course, being that she desperately wanted to be painted herself. You believe she was jealous? I know she was, Greaves said. Vera never painted her. She painted everyone else, family, friends, lovers, even that bloodsucker Rex. But not Lydia. Colville laughed. That is because she had no angles, darling. Lydia was an excellent woman, but she was dreadfully symmetrical. No soul, Major Halbert grunted. My sister wasn't a damn decoration. She was intelligent, too intelligent for this house. Poirot raised a hand gently. Your relationship with your sister was close? Geoffrey's jaw tightened. We wrote often. I'm posted in Berlin these days. I only arrived this morning after hearing the news. I haven't seen her in person for over a year. Yet you've chosen to remain here, Poirot asked. I had questions. Questions the Countess would not answer. And you, Miss Dane? Poirot turned to the quiet cousin. Were you close to Lydia? I suppose so. We shared a governess once, she stammered. But she changed. Lydia did. Over the last month she became afraid. Of what? I don't know. She didn't say. Just that there was something wrong in the house. Something no one else could see. Poirot's eyebrows lifted, but he said nothing. He turned last to Varner. And you, monsieur, were where last night? In my rooms, Varner said without hesitation. I have a study above the library. I read late. Tolstoy, as it happens. Until about 1. Did anyone see you? No. Poirot let the silence stretch. He examined each face in turn. A final question. Did any of you know of this letter Miss Halbert wrote? The silence was deafening. He smiled. No. Then I shall let you reflect on it. We will speak again. Soon. But for now, I thank you for your time. As we turned to leave, Poirot stopped at the door and looked back at the portrait through the window. The expression on the painted Countess's face seemed to shift under the dying light. Her painted hand frozen in warning or perhaps in guilt. Outside, I cleared my throat. Well, Poirot, what do you think? He stared up at the grim facade of the house. I think, Hastings, that in a house full of artists, illusions are easier to craft than truths. But rest assured, we shall find it. The grain de la vérité, even beneath a coat of crimson paint. There is a peculiar reverence with which Poirot examines a crime scene. Not like a policeman, prodding, measuring, testing, but like a scholar approaching a manuscript in a dead language. He does not touch until he has seen, and he does not speak until he has understood. That morning, as the grey mist clung to the windows of Bavonia House, I saw again that curious shift in him, the transition from man to mind. We returned to the east, gallery with Mr. Varner in tow. The long hall was suffused with cold northern light filtering through the arched windows. The portrait of the Countess loomed at the far end, now behind a silk rope hastily erected by the local constabulary. Beside it, the faint outline of a body still marred the Aubusson carpet. The air was tinged with turpentine, old varnish, and something subtler, a bitter scent that Poirot immediately detected. He knelt beside the impression in the carpet and examined it with deliberate care. Then, rising, he moved toward the painting. Its frame now cracked at the corner where Lydia had apparently slashed it days earlier. The slash had been repaired, somewhat crudely, but the brush strokes in that area no longer aligned perfectly. Strange, Poirot murmured. Most strange. What is? I asked. already scribbling notes in my pad. Poirot pointed. The place where she fell. It is not aligned with the natural vantage point from which one would view the portrait. If she were admiring it or confronting it, she would have stood 3 paces to the right, but this is the position of someone who has collapsed sideways, not forwards. Varner coughed delicately. It is possible, she staggered. Possible, but unlikely. She was a healthy young woman. There are no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, no spilled cup. Poirot turned his gaze toward the windows. And no scent of tea or coffee. You said she was to meet the Countess for tea? Varner nodded. Yes, around 10. The Countess found her at 5 past. Eh bien. Poirot raised a hand to the wall and ran a finger along the skirting. He stopped at a small decorative table near the painting. A fine layer of dust disturbed at one edge. Poirot leaned in. Mon ami, he said, calling me over. Observe, a cup once sat here. Recently. The circle is clean and there is a slight ring of residue. But the cup is gone. Precisely. He straightened, eyes glittering. This, Hastings, is not merely a murder, it is a performance. Someone staged this scene. Varner cleared his throat. But the only people with access to this gallery are members of the household, and the servants, of course. Poirot turned on him. Ah, yes, the servants. You have a maid, no? The one who brought the tea to Madame? Yes. Lottie, Austrian girl. Quiet, reliable. I would like to speak to her, Poirot said. Now. Lottie, the maid, was no more than 20, with wide eyes and a tendency to wring her hands so hard I feared she might strangle herself. Poirot was gentler with her than he was with most people. He spoke softly, kindly, and within 5 minutes had coaxed from her the following. She had prepared the tea tray shortly after 9. She placed 1 cup beside the Countess's usual chair and 1 for Miss Lydia. She brought the tray to the small vestibule near the gallery and left it on the console table. When she returned, at 10:30 to collect the tray, the 2nd cup was gone. You did not find that odd? Poirot asked. I thought maybe Miss Lydia took it in with her, or someone else fetched it. Did you see anyone near the gallery during that time? She hesitated. I saw Mr. Colville. He was on the stairs at around 10:15. I thought it strange because he was still in his dressing gown. Poirot nodded, thanking her. Merci, Lottie. That is all for now. We retired to the Countess's study, where Poirot promptly rearranged the pens on her desk until they were precisely equidistant. Hastings, he said, let us take stock. He began to pace slowly. Miss Lydia dies of a barbiturate overdose, yet no glass or vial is found. She is discovered lying beneath a portrait she once tried to destroy, in a gallery she was not expected to enter until tea time. Yes, I said, ticking the facts off on my fingers. She leaves behind a letter claiming the painting is poisoned. This is dismissed as delusion, but the painting was indeed slashed, and her fear was real. The Countess paints her final self-portrait with a new crimson pigment, correct? Yes, some kind of rare imported vermilion. Poirot stopped pacing. Hastings, you recall the case of Signora Calvi and the poisoned gloves? Vaguely. She developed arsenic poisoning through constant contact with dyed leather, didn't she? Exactly. In the Victorian age, many dyes and pigments contained lethal substances. Arsenic, mercury, lead. It was not until recently that safer alternatives were adopted. But an artist obsessed with tradition, with dramatic effect. He trailed off, then turned sharply. We must have that paint analyzed. But if Lydia never touched the painting again after slashing it, how could it have poisoned her? That, said Poirot gravely, is the heart of the matter. Later that evening, after supper, Poirot requested a private meeting with the Countess in her studio. The room was all angles and shadows, the smell of oils heavy in the air. Canvases were stacked against the walls like slumbering titans. The Countess stood near a small table, where brushes soaked in a cloudy jar of spirits. Poirot wasted no time. "Madame, you purchased a new crimson pigment for your final portrait." "Yes, from a supplier in Prague. It is an older recipe. Very fine. Do you know what it contains?" She narrowed her eyes. "Mercury sulfide, real cinnabar, not the synthetic kind the art stores sell." Poirot nodded. "You are not concerned by the toxicity?" "Not in the least. I've been painting with such materials all my life." Did Miss Lydia know what was in the paint? She might have. She was curious lately. She watched me work, asked questions. "And did you leave the portrait unattended the evening before her death?" The Countess's brows lifted. "Are you implying—" "I imply nothing, madame. I merely ask." She exhaled. "Yes, I left the studio at 7. The painting was drying. Lydia had been behaving erratically. I locked the door to the gallery, but the house key was misplaced last week. Anyone might have had it." "Thank you," Poirot said softly. "One last question. Did Lydia ever request to be painted by you?" "Once, a year ago. I refused." "Why?" "Because she had nothing to say with her face, nothing but resentment. She was beautiful, yes, but cold. No depth." Poirot inclined his head. "That, madame, may be the most honest thing anyone has said today." As we made our way back to our rooms, I could not contain my impatience. "Well," I said, "what do you think?" Poirot looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I think," he said, "that the answer lies not in the painting's poison, but in its purpose. Someone wanted Lydia to die here, before that portrait. To send a message." "A message?" He stopped at his door, hand on the knob. "Yes, Hastings. And the question is, to whom was it addressed?" He opened the door and stepped inside, leaving me staring into the darkened corridor, heart quickening. The following morning dawned with an austere chill, and the rooms of Pavonia House seemed more cavernous than ever, as though the very walls had absorbed the echo of Lydia Varner's death. Poirot rose early, dressed with greater fastidiousness than usual, and requested that all members of the household be assembled in the drawing-room by 10 o'clock. They must feel the presence of the inquiry, he told me over a breakfast of black coffee and precisely quartered toast. A guilty conscience does not respond well to silence. It thrives in the shadows. Let us bring it into the light. By 10, the household was gathered. The Countess Elena sat in a high-backed chair draped with velvet, expression unreadable. Julian Colville, her grandson, slouched nearby in a faintly crumpled suit. His fiancée, Miss Rachel Denholm, perched stiffly on the arm of a chaise, eyes flicking about the room like a trapped bird. Mr. Varner remained near the fire, pale and unsteady, and the ever-attentive butler, Marbury, stood respectfully at the rear. Poirot remained standing. "Messieurs, mesdames," he began, "this is not yet the final gathering." "No, but I believe it is time we examine what we know, and what we believe we know." He turned to Colville first. "Monsieur, you were seen near the East Gallery at 10:15 on the morning of the tragedy. Can you explain your movements?" Colville lifted an eyebrow. "I overslept. I was going down for coffee." "In your dressing gown?" "Obviously." Poirot paused, eyes narrowing. "And you saw no one?" "No." Poirot nodded slowly and moved on. "Miss Denholm, I understand you and Miss Lydia Varner were not close." She blinked. "We were civil." "And yet she was to be your sister-in-law. Surely there was some affection." Rachel's lips thinned. "Lydia was difficult, controlling. She did not approve of me. And yet the Countess approved of her." Rachel flushed. "I wouldn't say that." Poirot said nothing, only allowed the silence to stretch. It was Mr. Varner who broke it. "If you think we're hiding something, Monsieur Poirot, why not say it plainly?" Poirot turned toward him gently. "But I do not think it, monsieur. I know it. What remains is to learn what is being hidden, and by whom. After the gathering dispersed, Poirot requested to examine Lydia's bedroom. We ascended the great marble staircase, which split at the landing like a fork in a river, and followed the left passageway to a modest door. Lydia's room was neat, austere. There were few personal effects, no photographs, no adornments, only a writing desk, a narrow armoire, and a window with its curtains drawn. Poirot opened the desk drawer and examined its contents. Receipts, bank statements, a theatre program from a performance dated a week prior, and, folded at the back, a small cream-colored envelope. Poirot opened it. Inside was a torn fragment of a letter. The handwriting was small, meticulous. No longer tolerate the deception. If you do not tell her, I will. The truth cannot remain buried. That's all, I asked, leaning closer. Poirot nodded. But enough. Mon ami, what does this suggest to you? That Lydia was threatening someone. About a secret. Perhaps an affair. Or a betrayal. Something personal. Poirot replaced the fragment carefully. Whose writing is that, do you think? Poirot smiled thinly. That, Hastings, is what I intend to find out. At midday, Constable Drayle arrived from the local station with preliminary results from the lab analysis. Poirot met him in the library. The paint from the Countess's studio? Poirot asked. Drayle nodded. Contains genuine cinnabar, very toxic in large quantities. The lab found traces of mercury in the sample taken from the repaired section of the portrait. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Traces, you say? Yes, sir. Not enough to kill, unless someone were exposed repeatedly. And the cup? Poirot asked. We found one stashed in a cupboard beneath the gallery stairs. It contained residue consistent with phenobarbital. A cup containing barbiturates, Poirot said slowly. Hidden after the fact. Drayle nodded again. Almost certainly wiped clean before it was placed there. Poirot turned away and tapped a finger against his chin. Thank you, Constable. You have been most helpful. That afternoon, Poirot summoned Julian Colville to the study. I was permitted to remain. Colville arrived in a better mood, though there was a guardedness behind his eyes. Monsieur Colville, Poirot began, you're engaged to Miss Denholm, oui? That's correct. And yet Miss Lydia Varner did not approve. She was possessive. Of her brother. It's odd, but she could never quite let him go. Poirot inclined his head. A curious dynamic, no? You and Miss Denholm hope to marry by the end of the season? We still do. Poirot gestured to the desk. Monsieur, do you recognize this handwriting? Colville looked at the fragment of the letter. His brow furrowed. No, should I? I believe you do. I believe Lydia wrote this, and it was never sent. A threat of sorts. Colville's eyes widened. What are you suggesting? Poirot raised an eyebrow. That Lydia Varner discovered something damaging, something involving a deception, something she intended to expose. Julian shifted uncomfortably. Look, he said finally. There was something. Lydia discovered that Rachel had misrepresented her background, claimed her father was a retired professor when in fact he was a bankrupt speculator who left the country under disgrace. Ah, Poirot smiled. And how did she discover this? She hired a private investigator, I think. Went through Rachel's correspondence. And she intended to tell the Countess? I begged her not to, Colville muttered. But Lydia was immovable. She had this idea that Rachel was after Julian's inheritance, that she was a social climber. And was she? Julian met Poirot's gaze squarely. No. Rachel loves me. Whatever her family's history, it has no bearing on our future. Poirot said nothing for a long moment. Then he gave a small nod. Merci, monsieur. As the evening shadows crept across the walls, Poirot seemed agitated. Not frantic, he never is, but alert, as though sensing a false note in a symphony. We returned once more to the gallery. "There is something wrong, Hastings," he murmured. "Something that does not align." I followed his gaze to the painting, the Countess in her crimson finery, brush in hand, eyes fixed in silent judgment. Poirot approached it. "There is something theatrical about this portrait," he said. "Do you see, Hastings? The brush is angled not as though she is painting, but pointing." He stepped closer. The repaired section of the canvas stood out now, obvious once you saw it. Poirot stared at the brush in the painted hand. "Mon Dieu," he stepped back. "The portrait is not only a likeness, it is a message. The Countess painted herself not as she was, but as she wanted to be remembered. You think the painting hides something?" "No, I think it reveals something." He turned, eyes alight. "Hastings, I must speak with the Countess, now." We found the Countess in her music room, seated at the piano, though her fingers did not play. Poirot wasted no time. "Madame, I believe your portrait was meant to commemorate more than your image. It was meant to frame your legacy." "Is that so?" she said dryly. "Yes, and yet Miss Lydia attempted to destroy it." "Why?" The Countess said nothing. Poirot leaned forward. "She believed the painting was poisoned, and she was right, in part. It was not physically poisoned, but it was a symbolic poison. It represented your rejection of her, your unwillingness to acknowledge her place in the family." "That is absurd." Poirot's voice dropped. "She knew she was not your daughter, didn't she?" The silence that followed was more deafening than any denial. Poirot stepped back. "I believe Miss Lydia Varner was your child, illegitimate, raised as your ward's sister, a secret buried for decades." The Countess rose, trembling. "She found out last month," Poirot said gently. "She demanded recognition. You refused, and when she threatened to expose the truth, to paint the portrait anew with the truth of her birth, you saw no choice but to silence her." The Countess's mouth opened, then closed. But before she could speak, a sharp knock came at the door. It was Constable Drayle. "Sir," he said breathlessly, "we've just found Rachel Denholm, unconscious in the garden, an empty pill bottle beside her." It was a cruel irony that on the very day Poirot seemed to press nearest to the truth, tragedy struck again, this time not fatal, but urgent enough to send a ripple of panic through the old walls of Pavonia House. We followed Constable Drayle at once to the rear garden, Poirot moving with surprising speed despite the polished elegance of his attire. A group had already formed at the edge of the hedge maze. Marbury, the butler, pale and useless, Julian Colville pacing furiously, and one of the housemaids wringing her hands. There, beneath the budding arms of a chestnut tree, Rachel Denholm lay on a stone bench, her complexion ashen, her lips tinged bluish at the edges. An uncorked vial rested on the gravel beside her. Empty. "She's breathing," Drayle said quickly. "I've sent for the doctor." Poirot examined her face, then the bottle. His expression turned grim. "Phenobarbital," he said softly. "The same drug found in the hidden cup." "A suicide attempt," I whispered. "Perhaps, or perhaps someone wishes us to believe it was." Julian knelt beside Rachel and took her cold hand in his. "Rachel, my love," he murmured. "Why?" Poirot laid a hand gently on his shoulder. "Monsieur, do not jump to conclusions. Appearances can deceive. Let the doctor do his work." Dr. Kilburn, summoned from the nearby village of Carsbury, arrived swiftly and took charge. After administering an emetic and checking her pulse, he turned to us with furrowed brows. "She's fortunate," he said. "It seems the dose wasn't quite fatal, or she ingested it recently. We'll keep her under observation, but she's not out of danger." Poirot bowed his head in solemn gratitude. "Merci, docteur. She must be watched carefully." "Of course, but she'll be weak for days. If she can speak by tomorrow, we'll be lucky." That evening, Poirot and I dined alone in the Countess's study at her invitation. A cold supper had been laid out, though I could scarcely touch mine. Poirot, however, sipped a modest portion of wine and appeared deep in thought. 2 incidents, he murmured. One fatal, one nearly so, and both, Hastings, are like brush-strokes in a greater portrait. You suspect Miss Denholm didn't try to kill herself? I suspect everything, mon ami. The appearance of suicide is convenient, the timing precise. And tell me, why would a woman driven to despair choose the very drug used in the first murder? Perhaps to make a statement, I ventured. Or perhaps to draw attention away from the real killer. Poirot rose and crossed the room, standing by the window. There is something we have missed, something small, something that Lydia knew and someone else feared she would reveal. You still believe she knew a family secret? I do, but it may not be the one we imagine. After supper, Poirot asked to see the Countess again. She was composed, but only just. Her silken shawl fell about her shoulders like regal armor, but her face was drawn. Madame, Poirot said, you spoke no denial earlier when I suggested Lydia was your daughter. The Countess stared at the fire. There are things I have carried for decades, Monsieur Poirot. Secrets so buried I sometimes forget whether they truly happened. She was yours? Yes. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I was 15. Foolish. Seduced by a tutor my father dismissed quietly. My parents arranged for Lydia to be raised as Geoffrey's sister. My brother's child, they told society. I was married off to an Italian count by 18. I never spoke of her again. And she found out? Last year. I don't know how, but she came to me. Not with tears, but with demands. She wanted recognition, a name, a future. The Countess gripped the chair arm. I offered her a trust. She laughed in my face. Poirot's voice softened. And did you kill her? No. She looked up. I wanted her silenced, yes, but not by death. I only refused to admit the truth. Poirot nodded, but I knew he was not yet satisfied. Later that night, while the house slept, Poirot returned to the gallery once more. He paced beneath the great painted gaze of the Countess, eyes fixed on the brush she held in her hand. She points, he murmured, but not randomly. None, this is a woman who communicates in symbols. He followed the line of the brush's angle. It directed the eye not toward the viewer, but toward a nearby pedestal, the one that had once held Lydia's sculpture. Poirot knelt. The base was dustier than the rest of the room, but one edge bore a fine scratch. Fresh. Something had been prized open. He took out a small torch and examined the side. There, a panel, disguised in the ornate trim. He pressed gently. A faint click. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of papers. Poirot opened them delicately. A letter? A birth certificate. A photograph of the Countess holding a baby, her face obscured, but unmistakably younger. Mon Dieu, he whispered. I stepped closer. What is it? The final piece, Poirot said. Lydia was documenting the truth. Not to blackmail, but to prove who she was. He folded the papers carefully. And now we must ask, who would fear this discovery most? By the following morning, Rachel had regained consciousness. Dr. Kilburn allowed Poirot and me a brief audience. She was propped against white pillows, pale but coherent. Poirot took her hand gently. Mademoiselle, please, tell me, did you take the pills yourself? Rachel hesitated. I found the bottle in my room, on the nightstand. I didn't know where it came from. I thought it was meant as a warning. Poirot frowned. Did you drink anything that morning? She nodded weakly. Julian brought me tea, but I hadn't touched it yet. Then I saw the bottle and panic, I suppose. I just wanted it to stop. Merci. That is all for now. Outside her room, Poirot turned to me sharply. "Hastings, the bottle was planted. She was meant to take it, to die, and conveniently carry the suspicion of Lydia's death with her." "You mean someone tried to murder her?" "Précisément. And now I believe I know who." He strode down the corridor, eyes blazing. "Hastings, call everyone to the drawing room. C'est l'heure. It is time for the final gathering." There is a certain hush that falls over a room when the truth draws near, a hush not of peace, but of suspense. That hush lay over the drawing room of Pavonia House like a velvet shroud as the suspects assembled under Poirot's precise instructions. The Countess entered first, her movements slow and deliberate, as though every step were choreographed. Julian Colville followed, carrying the air of a man who had passed beyond confusion into brittle anger. Marbury, the butler, stood rigid near the door, looking rather like a pale statue of grief. Madeleine Quayle, tightly corseted and lipsticked, surveyed the others with theatrical curiosity. Basil, the Countess's son, entered last, late and without apology, his eyes half-lidded with indifference. Poirot stood before the marble fireplace, straight as a pin, his hands clasped behind his back. The portrait of the Countess loomed above him, as if presiding over the affair. "Mes amis," he began, "I have assembled you here not to point fingers, but to arrange the puzzle pieces on the table. The solution. She has been before us all along, if only we are willing to see it." I noticed, as he said this, the subtle reactions around the room. Julian's jaw twitching, Basil checking his watch, Madeleine smoothing a non-existent wrinkle on her skirt. Poirot continued, his voice calm and melodic. "Let us begin with the victim. Lydia Denholm. She came here not to create trouble, but to confirm a truth. She had discovered her parentage, that she was not the niece of the Countess, but her daughter. The Countess closed her eyes but did not deny it. That secret, you understand, was not shameful to Lydia. It was empowering. She had rights. She wished only for recognition, not revenge. But that truth, once uncovered, posed a threat to others in this house." He turned slowly, to those who feared what her existence meant. "Feared?" Julian's voice cracked. "She was a liar. Manipulative. She—" Poirot raised a finger. "Non, monsieur. You feared what she could reveal, and you, more than any, had cause. Not only were you in love with Rachel, but you had recently learned something most inconvenient, that the Countess was revising her will." Julian turned pale. "Yes," Poirot said. "A new heirloom trust was to be drawn up for Lydia. With this new arrangement, certain others, those living on the estate's largesse, would find themselves, how do we say, financially squeezed." Julian's mouth opened, but no words came. Poirot shifted his gaze. "And then we have Mademoiselle Quayle, a guest who, by some strange coincidence, arrives mere days before Lydia's death, under the guise of being an old friend." "I was her friend," Madeleine snapped. "Indeed. Then why is it that Lydia's personal diary, discovered in her luggage, mentions you only once, and with suspicion? MQ, again, why is she here? Not the note of an old companion, I think." Madeleine flushed crimson. "You see, Mademoiselle Quayle had a past, a quiet scandal in Vienna, a forged signature, a lost patron. Lydia, who had a gift for research, had stumbled upon this while preparing for an art exhibition. She intended to confront you, but alas, you preempted her, n'est-ce pas?" "I didn't kill her," Madeleine whispered. "I do not believe you did, but I believe you watched her with interest, perhaps even searched her room after her death, and perhaps, you found something that frightened you." Poirot paused, letting the silence stretch like drawn silk. "And then we have Rachel. She, too, discovered Lydia's parentage, confessed it to Julian. The love triangle, it thickens. But she, poor girl, was not your accomplice, Julian. She was your intended scapegoat. Julian shot to his feet. That's a lie. Poirot turned sharply. Sit down, Monsieur Colville. It was not a request, and to my surprise, Julian sat. Poirot's tone cooled. The drug, phenobarbital, was used twice. Once to kill Lydia, once to almost kill Rachel. And yet, no one in the house had access to it. He turned to the butler. Except you, Monsieur Marbury. The old man flinched. You were once a nurse before you entered service, were you not? Marbury nodded slowly. Lydia found that out, Poirot continued. She knew you had access to medication kept in the locked drawer of Lady Pavonia's medicine chest. But I never touched it, Marbury burst out. Not since the war. I swear on my life. I believe you, Poirot said quietly. But someone else used your knowledge to acquire it. He turned again, this time facing Basil Pavonia. Monsieur Basil, he said gently, you've said almost nothing throughout this ordeal, and yet I find your silence to be the loudest thing of all. Basil raised an eyebrow. Really, Poirot? I hardly knew the girl. No, but you knew what she represented. She was the Countess's daughter, and if she was acknowledged, she would become the primary heir, which meant you, Basil, would inherit nothing. A twitch at the corner of Basil's mouth. Poirot pressed on. You took the drug. From the medicine chest you'd seen Marbury open for years, you poisoned Lydia's drink that morning, and when Rachel grew suspicious, you placed the empty bottle in her room and brought her tea laced with just enough of the drug to kill her, if she drank it. You've no proof, Basil muttered. Ah, but I do. You see, Lydia was not only documenting her birthright. She made copies of everything, letters, certificates, even a photo of her as a baby, held by the Countess. Poirot lifted a sealed envelope from the table. She hid the originals in a hidden compartment, inside the pedestal beneath her sculpture. A clever artist, she left a visual clue. In the portrait, the brush held by the Countess points exactly to that pedestal. He walked forward and laid the envelope on the table. These documents will be handed to the authorities. They confirm everything. And perhaps, Basil, they will make clear that you had both motive and opportunity. Rubbish, Basil said with a sneer. Poirot stepped close, closer than I'd seen him stand to any suspect. There is one more detail, monsieur. The morning after Lydia's death, the maid discovered ash in the small fireplace of your study. Among the remains, the melted corner of a letter sealing wax, the same used by Lydia on her private correspondence. You tried to destroy something you couldn't replace, but it was too late. She had already hidden the rest. A tremor passed through Basil's cheek. For a moment, he stared at Poirot with a peculiar detachment, and then, suddenly, he bolted for the door. But Poirot was ready. Now Hastings. I sprang forward with a swiftness I didn't know I still possessed, intercepting Basil just as he reached the door. He swung once, wildly, but I caught him by the arm and pinned him with help from Drayle, who had entered silently moments earlier. You fools, Basil spat. She was nothing, a fraud. She ruined everything. She wanted only what was hers by right, Poirot said quietly. And you, monsieur, poisoned her for it. As the constable led Basil away, the drawing-room remained frozen in place. The Countess stood alone before the fireplace, her painted self looming behind her. She looked not heartbroken but aged, as though truth had turned her bones to dust. Poirot approached her gently. She was your daughter, and she deserved to be acknowledged in life, not only in death. The Countess nodded once, silently. Poirot turned, took up his hat and gloves, and beckoned me to the door. Outside, the sun had begun to break through the clouds, casting light through the hedges and across the gravel path. Poirot breathed deeply. It is always the psychology, Hastings, always. The mind, not the weapon, reveals the murderer. Do you feel justice has been done? I asked him. Poirot gave a sad smile. As much as it can be, mon ami, For even the truth, once uncovered, cannot resurrect the dead. And with that, Hercule Poirot walked down the path, his gait brisk and upright, the wind tugging ever so slightly at his perfectly brushed moustache. I had seen Poirot deliver many final explanations in my time, a mixture of dramatic flair and logical clarity. But never had I witnessed one quite like this. Basil Pavonia had been arrested. Yes, the drug, the motive, the forged alibi, all tied up neatly. Yet the next morning, as we prepared to leave Pavonia House, Poirot's restlessness remained. "Something gnaws at me, Hastings," he murmured, his brow furrowed as he stared at the morning light seeping through the sitting-room curtains. "The puzzle, it is solved, but the picture, it is not yet complete." "I don't see what's missing," I said, nursing my tea. "You caught Basil. He had motive, means, and access to the drug. He feared Lydia's inheritance would erase his own future, and he tried to kill Rachel to cover his tracks. What more is there?" Poirot tapped the window-sill with a gloved finger. "Why did Lydia arrange the meeting in the gallery at all? To confront the Countess, wasn't it?" "Mais non. If that were her only goal, she could have done so privately, discreetly. But instead she insisted on public confrontation, in the room beneath the portrait. It was not to speak, Hastings. It was to show. Something." I hesitated. "You think she intended to reveal her discovery about the hidden compartment in the pedestal?" Poirot gave a slow nod. "She planned it with intention, but the question remains. Why such haste? Why force a reckoning when she had already made copies of the documents and hidden the originals? What was she afraid of?" I was still pondering that when Marbury, the butler, knocked at the door and entered. He held out a small silver-laced envelope. "This was found among Miss Denholm's belongings, sir," he said. "It appears to be a letter, addressed to Lady Pavonia, but unopened." Poirot took it gently, studied the handwriting, and slit it open with a silver letter-opener. He read in silence, lips tightening. Then he held it out to me. "Read, Hastings." The letter was dated 2 days before Lydia's death. "Dearest Lady Pavonia, I know the truth now. About who I am, about who you are to me. I don't come with bitterness, only the desire to know you as my mother. But I must warn you, someone else knows, someone who does not wish this truth to come to light. I found signs that my things have been searched, papers disturbed. I fear what might happen if I confront you alone. I will speak publicly, in the gallery, where others can bear witness. That is the safest course. Please meet me there at noon." Lydia Poirot folded the letter carefully and laid it on the mantel. Mon Dieu, she feared for her life, and yet she came anyway. That is not the act of a blackmailer, it is the act of a daughter. I saw his jaw set with the quiet fury he reserved for those who preyed on the vulnerable. Basil was not the only one with something to lose. That is what I have missed. "Wait," I said. "You're suggesting someone else. We. And I believe that someone did not intend to kill Lydia. No, murder was not the plan. Discrediting her was." I blinked. "Discredit?" Poirot nodded. "Picture it. Lydia publicly reveals her identity, perhaps even unveils the documents, and then someone produces a forged letter, a claim, a past indiscretion. The crowd doubts her, the Countess denies it, the papers are destroyed, her claim collapses. But that plan went wrong. Yes, something changed. Perhaps Lydia saw through it. Perhaps she threatened to go to the press, and so la pauvre fille was silenced." Poirot turned to me abruptly. "Come, Hastings, we must speak to the Countess. One last time." We found Lady Pavonia in her morning room, her tea untouched, her gaze distant as she stared into the garden. "Madame," Poirot began gently, "forgive the intrusion. There is one truth still obscured, and I must bring it to light." The Countess gave a slow nod. "I suspected you might return." "You see," Poirot continued, It is not only Basil who stood to lose everything. You too faced a terrible consequence." She didn't move, but her knuckles whitened around the armrest of her chair. "If Lydia's parentage became public knowledge, your entire reputation, your family's legacy, would be ruined. You would be seen as a liar, a fraud, an unwed mother who passed off her daughter as a niece. In certain circles, social death." "I never wanted that," she said quietly. "I told you, I never harmed her." "But you feared her," Poirot pressed, "and so you allowed others to handle it. You closed your eyes, you let Basil act. Perhaps you even knew what he planned, though you convinced yourself it would not go so far." A long silence followed. Then, in a voice like old paper tearing, she said, "He told me he could frighten her, shake her, make her retreat." "You did not stop him," Poirot said softly. "I didn't know he would poison her," she whispered. "But you suspected it after she died," he replied. "And still, you said nothing." Her silence was the answer. Poirot rose. "I will not betray your confession, madame. The law has Basil in custody. He will face justice. But your guilt, you must carry it." The Countess looked up at the portrait above the fireplace. Her younger self, hand extended with the brush, forever poised to paint. "I was never the woman she believed me to be," she said. "That's the worst of it." She looked at me with hope. "And I had only shame." Poirot bowed slightly. "She wanted a mother, madame. Not a title, not a name. Simply a mother." We left her there, seated beneath the gaze of her painted youth, as silent as a statue of grief. That evening Poirot and I boarded the train back to London. He was quiet for a time, gazing out at the countryside slipping by. At last, he spoke. "It was not just a case of murder, Hastings. It was a case of identity. The tragedy of Lydia Denholm is that she wanted only to be acknowledged. But for some, acknowledgement meant ruin." "You did what you could," I said. Poirot nodded. "Yes, and yet there is a melancholy in such victories. The killer is unmasked, the motives laid bare. But the child who sought a place in the world, she is gone." I offered him a cigarette, which he refused with a shake of his head. "There is a poison greater than phenobarbital, mon ami," he said quietly. "It is the poison of pride, of the lies we tell to protect our reputation, even at the cost of those who love us." He straightened his cuffs, his voice resuming its usual firmness. "But enough of sorrow. Justice, she has prevailed. And now, perhaps a quiet evening and a hot chocolate, eh?" I smiled. "Sounds perfect." And as the train carried us back to London, Hercule Poirot closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to reflect, ever watchful, as the countryside faded into twilight. In the days that followed, the scandal gripped the London papers like a dog with a bone. "Countess's son arrested for murder in gallery drama," screamed the Daily Sketch. "Painter's death was no accident, detective claims," echoed the Times with a rare mention of Poirot's name, misprinted as Poirot. The press had a field day, but inside the walls of Pavonia House, silence reigned. Lady Pavonia did not leave the estate. The servants whispered that she took her meals in the morning room and spent hours alone in the gallery, staring up at the portrait of herself, painted in brighter days by the daughter she never acknowledged. Basil, meanwhile, was remanded into custody. Poirot, having arranged for all evidence and relevant testimony to be passed to Inspector Japp, left the finer details of prosecution to Scotland Yard. We had remained in London a few extra days, at Poirot's insistence, for he had yet another loose thread to pull, and I must admit, I was eager to see it tugged. We returned to the city and, surprisingly, not to our flat on Whitehaven Mansions, but to a modest row house on a quiet street near Paddington. Poirot had received a letter, one he had not shown me, but I was soon introduced to its author. "Miss Rachel Carslake," he said, ushering me into the parlor of a dim but tastefully appointed home. A woman with far more sense than she lets on. Rachel, pale but composed, rose from the settee. "Captain Hastings," she said, shaking my hand with firm dignity. "Please forgive the state of things. I haven't been back long." "No apologies necessary," I said. "I'm glad to see you well." "I wanted to speak to you, Mr. Poirot," she said, turning to him. "I've been thinking about Lydia, about everything, and I need to know why she never told me." Poirot regarded her with that deep, intense gaze of his. "She was protecting you, mademoiselle. You were the only person in her life she could trust completely. She feared if you knew the truth about her parentage, you might be drawn into the very scandal she sought to avoid." Rachel sat down, hands twisting nervously. "I still can't believe Basil. I always thought he was jealous, yes, but not murderous. He was cold, but clever." "Ah," Poirot said, seating himself across from her, "but cleverness without heart, mademoiselle, is like a blade without a sheath. Sharp, dangerous, and often turned upon the hand that wields it." She smiled faintly. "Do you believe Lydia died at peace? That she knew the truth would out?" Poirot paused. "She left instructions for a solicitor in the event of her death, copies of the birth records, letters from the Countess, and a full confession she had written, but never sent, to her mother. She feared she would not survive her confrontation, and yet she acted." Rachel's eyes welled up. "She was always braver than I was." Poirot rose and placed a hand on her shoulder. "She was brave, yes, but also wise. She knew when to confront and when to protect. You must remember her for the fullness of who she was, not only for how she died." Rachel looked up at him. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, for everything." As we returned to our flat, I ventured to ask what had been troubling me all morning. "You're sure the Countess wasn't involved more directly? That she didn't—" Poirot shook his head. "No. She did not poison Lydia. She did not encourage Basil explicitly. But she chose blindness, Hastings. She allowed her shame to guide her silence, and that is a crime of the heart, even if not of the court." "She'll pay for it in her own way," I said. "Indeed. A prison of guilt, often worse than the prison of stone." Several weeks later, we were invited to a small private gallery opening in Mayfair. The event featured works by Lydia Denholm, some early studies, some recent portraits recovered from her flat. Poirot insisted we attend. The gallery was quiet, attended only by a few connoisseurs and art critics. Rachel was present, standing beside a striking portrait of Lydia herself, painted in vivid oils, one I hadn't seen before. "She did this the year before she died," Rachel said when we joined her. "Said it was her way of owning her face, her legacy." It was a remarkable piece, vulnerable and bold at once. Lydia's eyes looked directly at the viewer, calm, unafraid. There was a small plaque beneath it. "Lydia Denholm, born Lydia Pavonia. Self-portrait. Gifted posthumously by Miss Rachel Carslake." I looked to Poirot. "So it's public knowledge now?" He nodded. Rachel decided to release the information after the trial. She thought Lydia would want the truth acknowledged at last. The name Pavonia may carry scandal now, but also honor. He stepped closer, tilting his head to examine the fine strokes. "She has signed it differently," he said. "See, not L. Denholm, but simply Lydia." Rachel overheard and smiled. She said once that names were prisons. She wanted this portrait to show the woman she chose to be. Poirot gave a rare, solemn nod. "Then it is well chosen." The trial was swift, at least by the standards of such affairs. Basil Pavonia was found guilty of murder in the first degree. The evidence, assembled meticulously by Poirot, was overwhelming. The jury deliberated less than a day. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Sentenced to life imprisonment, he was transferred quietly from Wandsworth to an undisclosed location. The Countess did not attend the trial, Nor did she speak to the press. In time, she was seen less and less in London society. It was said she withdrew to the countryside. Rumor had it she commissioned a new portrait of Lydia, painted from an old photograph, and hung it in the room where her own likeness once loomed. A small redemption, perhaps, or perhaps a penance. One rainy afternoon, back in our apartment, I found Poirot bent over a letter, sealed with thick cream of paper and the Pavonia crest. "A letter from Lady Pavonia?" I asked. He nodded and passed it to me. Inside, written in an elegant, slanted hand, "Monsieur Poirot, I shall never be able to thank you properly for what you did, for your clarity, your courage, your unwillingness to be misled by silence. Lydia was not the only one trapped by legacy, but you gave her voice back to her. I shall spend the rest of my days listening to it. Yours, A. Pavonia." Poirot folded the letter and placed it gently in a drawer. "A rare thing," he said quietly. "What is?" "Regret. Expressed truthfully, accepted without excuse." I nodded. "And what now?" Poirot leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Now, Hastings, I believe we deserve a holiday. A short one, perhaps to the coast. Somewhere with less drame artistique, yes?" I laughed. "As long as no portraits are poisoned, I'm in." And so we planned to leave the city, knowing that justice had been served. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but precisely. Poirot had used his little grey cells, as always. But it was the heart, too, the search for truth behind masks, behind names, that had brought peace at last. One bright morning in early spring, some weeks after Basil Pavonia's conviction, I found myself standing with Poirot on the deck of the ferry to Dieppe. The air was cool and fresh with salt, the gulls circling overhead in lazy spirals. Poirot, swaddled in a neatly buttoned overcoat and a silk cravat, looked most displeased with the breeze tugging at his mustache. "Ah, Hastings," he muttered, gripping the rail. "I do not understand the English and their love of wind in the face. It is bracing, they say. Pah! It disarranges the mustache and fogs the mind." "You'll recover with a good lunch," I said cheerfully, watching the coastline recede behind us. "Besides, I thought you needed a change of scenery." He gave a non-committal grunt, but did not entirely disagree. The case of Lydia Denholm had taken more out of him than most. After a moment of companionable silence, he turned to me, hands folded behind his back. "You know, Hastings, this case, cette affaire terrible, it had the structure of a tragedy more than a crime." "A tragedy," I echoed. Poirot nodded solemnly. "Oui. There was no joy in the solution. The guilty were caught, yes, but the innocent, they suffered nonetheless. Lydia died not for greed or hatred, but because she tried to claim what was hers. Truth, identity, love. He looked out to sea, and she died before anyone could say, 'You belong.' That, mon ami, is the true cruelty." I didn't quite know what to say. Poirot, for all his love of order and symmetry, always took such losses personally. Not in the way a man grieves a friend, but as if each death were a flaw in the fabric of humanity he so tirelessly tried to mend. "I suppose," I offered, "in a way, her name lives on now. Her art is being shown. Rachel's taken up her cause. Even the Countess, well, perhaps she'll remember Lydia with something like love." Poirot gave a quiet hum. "Yes, there is that. But still I wonder, how often do we let pride silence truth? How many lives are bent, twisted, ruined by the fear of being known?" "Too many," I said. "But you made sure hers was remembered." That made him smile faintly. "You are too kind, Hastings. I only followed the threads. It was Lydia who left them behind for me to find." After returning from Dieppe, we settled into a quieter rhythm in our London flat. Poirot took on 2 minor cases, one involving a stolen emerald brooch, the other an accountant with an overactive imagination. But I could see his mind still lingered on Pavonia House. One afternoon, I found him sorting through his notebook. He kept meticulous case notes, naturally, pausing over a page that read simply, "LD Truth concealed by shame, dies unless named. Justice is not always triumph. Sometimes it is remembrance." I said nothing as he closed the book and placed it back in the drawer. Later that evening, as we dined on Saule Meunier at a modest restaurant near Soho, I ventured a question. "Poirot," I said, "you told the Countess she would have to carry her guilt, but you didn't press her publicly. You didn't push for a full confession." "Why?" He set his fork down with delicate precision. "There is a justice of the law, Hastings," he said softly, "and a justice of the soul. I do not confuse them. Basil committed the murder. He planned it, executed it, attempted a second. He faces prison. And the Countess? She committed the crime of silence, of cowardice. She let her shame dictate her morality, but that is not a crime for the courts. It is a sentence handed down by conscience. She lives now with the truth, and that is a punishment I cannot increase, nor would I." I nodded slowly. "Do you think she will ever forgive herself?" "Ah," Poirot said, dabbing his lips with a napkin, "that is the mystery we shall never solve." We received a letter from Rachel Carslake 2 months later. She had taken up a residency at an artists' colony in Brittany, far from London's gossip and memory. Her note was brief, but poignant. "Monsieur Poirot, I thought you might like to know. Lydia's final collection has been accepted for permanent exhibition in the National Portrait Gallery. Her name, her full name, will be listed. I think she would have liked that." With thanks, Rachel Carslake Poirot read the letter once, then again, then folded it and placed it in the same drawer with the Countess's note. 2 letters, 2 women, 2 different kinds of grief. That evening we walked through St. James's Park, just as the light turned golden and long shadows stretched across the path. Spring was settling in, and the city felt briefly young again. "Did you ever paint, Hastings?" Poirot asked suddenly. "Me? Good Lord, no, I can barely sketch a map." He smiled faintly. "And yet, artists and detectives, we are not so different. Both seek truth. Both study form, contrast, light. And both know that sometimes the smallest detail, a brushstroke, a glance, is the key to understanding the whole." "Then I shall continue to leave the details to you," I said with a laugh. We strolled on, the gravel crunching beneath our shoes, London unfolding around us with its 1,000 unsolved stories. Poirot would go on to solve many more cases, of course. Some clever, some dark, some downright absurd. But I know the case of Lydia Denholm stayed with him, not for its trickery or its puzzle, but for its sorrow. It reminded us both that even among the drawing rooms and dinner parties of England's upper crust, beneath the masks and manners, there are wounds unhealed. Secrets buried not just to deceive others, but to protect ourselves from shame. Yet sometimes, as Lydia believed, the truth must be spoken, even at a cost, especially at a cost. On the mantel of Poirot's study, beneath his silver-framed photograph of Belgium's King Leopold, stood a small reproduction of Lydia's final self-portrait. Just a postcard-sized print, carefully framed. No signature, no title, only her face, steady and clear, looking out as if to say, "I am here, and I matter." I asked Poirot once why he kept it. He did not answer directly. He simply said, "She wished to be seen." I, Hercule Poirot, do not often speak plainly of myself. Modesty, though not always among my greatest virtues, demands restraint. But from time to time, a case does not simply end with the apprehension of the criminal. It lingers. It stays in the fibers of one's suit, the corners of one's desk, the quiet hours of morning. And so it is with the case of the Countess and her poisoned portrait. Ah, but what a name, no? Sensational, Romantic, tragic, a perfect headline for the English imagination. And yet, beneath the drama, it was not a tale of high society, nor even of murder. It was a tale of recognition, of what it means to be seen and unseen. The Countess, the son, the daughter, all ensnared in their own silences. Let us begin with her, shall we? Anastasia Pavonia, the last Countess of a title clinging to its last glories. A woman carved in marble, lovely, imperious, and brittle. She who denied her daughter's name in order to preserve her own. I met her first in the gallery beneath the portrait, and even then she was veiled in performance. To be the Countess was not merely a title for her, it was a defense, a fortress against the world. She had spent her life protecting an illusion. To admit she had once loved a penniless painter and borne his child was in her mind a betrayal of everything she believed she must be. And yet, when the truth came to her, she did not rage, she did not collapse. She simply sat, motionless, and stared into the eyes of her own likeness, painted not by her old lover, but by the daughter whose name she had erased. That is not guilt I will soon forget. Then there was Basil, a young man with ice in his veins, he who believed himself the natural heir to a legacy built on lies. In his soul was a terrible logic. If my sister is not recognized, then she is nothing. If she is nothing, then I may do anything to her, even this. I do not pity him, but I understand him. His tragedy is not that he was monstrous, but that he was ordinary, a man who confused entitlement with justice and cruelty with strength. Ah, and Lydia. Her portrait hangs now in the National Portrait Gallery. Her work is shown in salons and retrospectives. She is praised posthumously, as so many artists are, with words she never lived to hear. But I remember her differently. I remember her calm, her clarity. When I first saw her work, I thought, this is not the work of a woman who wishes to be famous. It is the work of a woman who refuses to disappear. That my friend Hastings did not fully grasp. But I did. She came to the Countess not to beg for status or money, but for acknowledgement, for a truth to be spoken aloud, a name placed beside a face, and in return she was given rejection and, eventually, death. Yet even in death she was victorious. Her truth could not be buried. It lives in canvas, in color, in every deliberate brush stroke. It lives in Rachel Carslake, who carries her memory forward not with revenge, but with love. It lives in the Countess, who now walks the long corridors of Pavonia House and must pass not only her own portrait, but the one of Lydia that she herself commissioned after all was revealed. A silent, daily reckoning. It is a curious thing, the human heart. I have often said that crime is not born in the act, but in the mind, in the fracture, the contradiction. And in this case, the crime was not only murder. No, the deeper crime was erasure, the attempt to unmake a person by denying her past. This is something Poirot cannot abide. Non, non, mille fois non. Because to deny a person's truth is to unpick the threads that hold the soul together. And what is the role of Hercule Poirot, if not to restore order, to mend the design, to ensure that each thread is placed correctly, no matter how uncomfortable the pattern becomes? Do you see, mes amis, why I accepted this case with such interest? It was not simply about art, nor even justice. It was about dignity, about naming a truth that others wished forgotten. And so I named it. People often imagine that I enjoy my victories, that I bask in the triumph of outwitting the criminal. But no, not always. There are victories that feel more like funerals. When I watched Basil Pavonia led away in handcuffs, I did not feel satisfaction. I felt inevitability. He was not a criminal genius, merely a small man with too much to prove. He believed that by removing Lydia, he could protect his own claim to the family's legacy. But all he did was confirm its collapse. For a legacy built on denial cannot stand. And the Countess? Ah, She is a woman I will think of often, not because she was cruel, but because she was afraid. Afraid of scandal, afraid of shame, afraid of being known. And in that fear, she inflicted pain upon the one person who had once loved her without condition. I did not punish her. That was not my task, but I left her with the full weight of truth. That is punishment enough. I will leave you with this. In my little flat in London, so neat, so symmetrical, I have placed Lydia's postcard-sized portrait in a modest frame beside my morning reading chair. I look at it each day with my tisane, not because it is perfect, but because it is honest. She looks out with that quiet determination, the strength of someone who knew who she was, even when the world refused to see her. And so I see her, not as victim, not even as artist, but as truth made visible. People often ask me, Monsieur Poirot, what is the greatest mystery you have ever solved? I smile. I adjust the cuffs of my sleeve. I smooth my mustache, and I say, it is always the same mystery, mes amis. The human heart, it has depths no evidence can plumb, and yet, avec les petites cellules grises, even it may be understood. That is the work, that is the calling, and that is why I do not stop, even now, even tomorrow, even when no one else sees what I see, because someone must. Someone must.